Ways to gather data. We're going to study three main types of ways to gather data this semester. One is an observational study, two is a sample survey, and three is an experiment. The two main branches are an observational study versus an experiment. We're going to talk about observational studies first. An observational study observes individuals and measures variables of interest, but does not attempt to influence the responses. So an observational study is one where we don't apply treatments. We merely observe behaviors that are already happening. An observational study then can show associations. Which does not imply causality. All right, so an experiment, when we get there in number 3, the main difference is going to be that in an experiment we apply treatments. In an observational study we don't. We merely observe what's already happening. A response variable is the variable that measures the outcome or result of a study. So the response variable is the thing that we measure at the end. So the purpose of an observational study is to describe some group or situation, which we've already discussed, meaning we're literally just showing an association. We're describing what's already happening. The population for a statistical study is the entire group of individuals about which we want information. And the sample is the part of the population from which we actually collect information and is used to draw conclusions about the whole. So we use the information from the sample to say something about the population. For instance, if I want to study the average weight of a USC student, my population would be all USC students. But I know it's not feasible for me to get every single USC student and weigh them. So what would I do in a realistic setting? I would get a sample from that population. I might choose maybe 100 USC students at random, so I could weigh them. I could get a sample estimate, the sample average weight, and I would use that to estimate the average weight of the population. So the population is the larger group of individuals, and the sample is the smaller part from the population that we actually get our information from. Two main things I want to highlight here, so that if you get in a sticky situation trying to pick out the population and the sample, for the population, focus on the part of the definition that says the population is the larger group that we want to get information from. Trust me, that will help you in a minute. And for the sample, focus on the part that says it's the part of the population from which we actually collect information. And it's used to draw conclusions about the whole. We'll come back to that in a minute. So a sample survey, number 2, is actually, remember I said the two main branches of ways to gather data are an observational study versus an experiment. But we've got this other bullet in here. We've got number 2, a sample survey. A sample survey is actually a special type of observational study. A sample survey is one where the individuals provide their own data. So let's get an idea in our mind. Let's say I was studying that average weight of a USC student. Let's think about that study again. If I weighed the people myself, if I recruited 100 USC students randomly, got them to come in to the Thompson Student Health Center, and weighed them on the scale, then it would be an observational study. However, if I asked them how much they weigh without actually observing their weights myself, they provide their data to me, I ask them how much they weigh, and they tell me how much they weigh, then we're in the special type of observational study, the sample survey. So a sample survey is a special type of observational study where the individuals provide their own data. So we say sample because we're using a sample from the population, and survey because those individuals are providing their own data. All right, so we accentuate those last two facts here. A sample because it is only a part of the population, and it's a survey because the individuals provide their own responses. So this brings us to a census. A census is a sample survey that attempts to include the entire population as the sample. Hopefully you've all heard of the U.S. Census that's required by the Constitution every 10 years. This is a survey of the population. However, notice that your text still calls it a sample survey. And they don't say it's a survey of the population. That's because even though we try really hard, it's basically impossible to actually survey everyone in the population. So we can take a look at the data that the census provides us. Visiting the census.gov/2010 census webpage, you can see that the government does a pretty good job of providing transparency for the results of a census. Notice the graphic right here on the front page, the 2010 Census District of Columbia profile, population by sex and age. I want to just point out right now that this is actually an example of a back-to-back histogram. We'll be talking about graphical displays back in chapters 10 and 11, and typically we would recommend side-by-side box plots for comparing two data sets like this, where we have one box plot for males and one for females, but the census website chose to do a histogram for males and a separate histogram for females and put them back to back. Normally a histogram would be turned on its side from what it's showing here. So we get a good idea of the distribution of ages for females in the DC area and a good idea of the distribution of ages for males. So we can see that for females, the most common age, because the longest pink bars are in the 20s and 30s, and for the males, it looks like the most common ages are 30 to 35, because the longest blue bars, well, actually they're from the 20 to 35 range, somewhere in there. So very similar distributions. Over here on the left, you could use the drop-down menu and choose your state and check out the data for your state. So why did we say it was so important for you, because you'll be contacted by the census next, to actually respond to the census? Well, it's really important. Check out this article. Dozens of U.S. cities line up to contest the 2010 census. Notice that this was published in June of 2011, so shortly after the 2010 census was complete. So let's read just a little short bit here. With jobs and federal aid at stake, U.S. cities are lining up to contest their 2010 census counts as too low. A decade ago, there were 1,200 challenges filed by cities, towns, and counties. The U.S. Conference of Mayors is predicting a big jump in that number due in part to tighter budgets that make local officials more sensitive to potential drop-offs in federal money for Medicaid and other programs. Nearly $450 billion in federal aid is distributed to states based on the population each year, or roughly $1,500 per person. So the point of showing you this article is to let you know that it is important to respond to the census because it has important ramifications. In review so far, we've learned that an observational study is one in which you merely observe what's already happening. You don't apply treatments, so you can only show associations. Developing a causal relationship out of an observational study is a little bit more difficult. So for now, we're just going to say that we can only talk about associations between variables from an observational study. A sample survey is a special type of observational study where the individuals provide their own data. Again, if I was weighing people, it would be an observational study. If I asked people how much they weighed and they told me they provided their own data, then it's a survey. A census is a special type of sample survey where we try to get the whole population as our sample. So let's do two examples where we pick out the population and the sample. Example 3. The University of Pennsylvania's National Annenberg Election Survey conducted a poll from July 30th to August 5th, 2004. They asked, do you favor or oppose federal funding of research on diseases like Alzheimer's using stem cells taken from human embryos? The survey reported that the poll consisted of 1,345 randomly selected adults in the United States. Now let's think back to that definition of population and definition of sample that we were talking about a moment ago. The population is the larger group of individuals that we want information from. Here, the poll consisted of 1,345 randomly selected adults in the U.S., so I would say that the population is all adults in the U.S., so all U.S. adults. The sample is the smaller group, the smaller part of the population that we actually get data from. Here we had 1,345 randomly selected adults in the United States. So the 1,345 adults that participated are our sample. So the 1,345 adults participating is our sample. Example 4. A sociologist wants to know the opinions of employed adult women about government funding for daycare. She obtains a list of the 500 members of a women's club and mails a questionnaire to 100 of these women selected at random. Only 41 questionnaires are returned. Again, we want to identify the population and the sample, and then we're going to talk about the percent of women contacted who responded, or the response rate. So here's where we really want to think about that strict definition of a population. You may be thinking of two separate answers that could be correct for the population here. It says a sociologist wants to know the opinions of employed adult women about government funding for daycare. But she obtains a list of the 580 members of a women's club and chooses her sample from the members of the women's club. So which one of these is the population? Well, if we think back to our definition, the population is the group that we actually want to say something about. So in this case, the sociologist wants to know the opinions of employed adult women, and so that's our population. So think to that strict definition, it's the group that you want to get information on. So the target group that we want to get information on here is employed adult women. So obviously this researcher couldn't get a list of all employed adult women to take a sample from, so she got the next best thing. She got a list of the 580 members of a women's club. We're actually going to call that later, in a later chapter, we're going to call that a sampling frame. Sort of the next best thing to a population when we can't obtain a list of the whole population to get a sample from. So now we have to pick out the sample. The sample is the smaller group chosen from the population that we actually get data from. So again, you might be thinking of two separate answers here. 100 women were selected at random to participate, but only 41 questionnaires were returned. So which one of these is the sample? Well, if we think about our strict definition, the sample is the smaller group from the population that we actually get data from. So the 41 employed adult women who returned their surveys is our sample. Now what's a name for those 100 women that were selected at random? That was just who we wanted to be in our sample, but the sample is who we actually get data from. And so only 41 women returned their surveys, so our sample ended up being the 41 women who returned the surveys. So this brings us to a topic that comes up a lot in surveys, the response rate. So how do we compute the response rate? That's the percent of women who participated in the survey. So to remind you of how to compute a percentage, we're going to think through this one, because there are people who take this course who haven't been in school for a while, and so it's nice to walk through one example to hammer out how to compute a percentage again. So our percentage is going to be 41, the number who returned their surveys out of the 100 who were chosen. And when you write a fraction like that, you can punch it in your calculator as 41 divided by 100. And that's going to give you the number 0.41. And how do you change that to a percentage? Move your decimal over 2 places to the right. So 0.41 as our proportion equates to 41% of the women contacted responded.